Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. Mark Davis had always lived a life bound by the constraints of survival. At just 23 years old, he was drowning in student debt, struggling to balance his final year of law school and the part-time job that barely kept his head above water. His father's debt still loomed over him, a shadow that seemed impossible to escape. Every day was another mountain to climb, but today, Mark would face an offer that would change his life forever. The rain pounded the streets of a small town in Texas as Mark trudged toward the cafe, his backpack heavy with the weight of his thoughts. His phone buzzed, and he answered it with a quiet, weary voice. Mark Davis speaking. Mr. Davis, this is Eleanor Brooks. I would like to meet with you. It's about your financial situation. Mark frowned. I'm sorry, who are you? He asked, his voice thick with confusion. I know enough, Eleanor interrupted smoothly, her tone commanding yet calm. Meet me at Brooks Bistro, 7:00 p.m. It's important. And just like that, the call ended. Mark stood there for a moment, staring at his phone, the cold rain soaking into his jacket. Who was this woman? What did she know about his life? He didn't have time to dwell on it, his bills weren't going to pay themselves. With a resigned sigh, Mark made his way to the bistro, his heart heavy with worry. The bistro was warm, a contrast to the storm outside. Mark stepped inside, the scent of coffee and freshly baked bread greeting him. The dim lighting made the atmosphere feel intimate, almost too intimate for someone like him. As he walked through the door, he spotted Eleanor sitting at a corner table, her sharp features illuminated by the soft glow of a candle. She looked poised, confident, and a little out of place for a man like Mark. Mr. Davis, she said, her voice smooth and precise. Please, have a seat. He sat across from her, his nerves on edge. What was this all about? Eleanor placed her cup of tea down and studied him for a moment before speaking. I know you're struggling, Mark. Your father's debts, your education, the weight of it all. I have a solution for you. Mark leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. A solution? Yes, she said, her gaze unwavering. I need a husband. Mark blinked, unsure if he had heard her right. I'm sorry, what? Eleanor's smile didn't waver. It's a business arrangement, nothing more. You marry me, and I'll pay off all your debts. I'll take care of everything. Your financial troubles will disappear. In return, you'll be my husband, in name only. No love, no affection. Just a partnership. Mark's heart raced. Was this a joke? Who made offers like this? But the more he thought about it, the more it seemed like his only option. The crushing weight of his father's debts, his mother's medical bills, the rent due tomorrow, it was too much. He could say no, but he didn't know what else to do. Why me? Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Because you're young, desperate enough to accept, and unattached. I don't need love, Mark. I need someone to help me secure my legacy. Someone I can trust to keep things in order. You will marry me, and in return, you'll have everything you've ever wanted. Eleanor's tone was calm, almost reassuring. Mark sat back, his mind spinning. He needed time to think, but the truth was, he didn't have time. He was drowning. And Eleanor's offer felt like a lifeline. I'll think about it, Mark said finally, his voice shaky. Eleanor's smile softened. Take your time. But don't take too long. This opportunity won't last forever. The words echoed in Mark's mind as he left the bistro and walked back out into the storm. His thoughts were a jumble of confusion and desperation. Was he really considering this? Was this his only way out? As he stepped back onto the rain-soaked streets, his phone buzzed again. It was his mother, reminding him of the bills piling up, reminding him of the responsibilities that weighed on him. Mark paused on the sidewalk, looking up at the dark sky. He had never felt more alone, yet now, a strange possibility seemed to hover before him. Could this be the answer to everything he'd been struggling with? Could a marriage without love just contract the key to his freedom? With a heavy heart, Mark walked home, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. Let's return to Mark's decision. The following morning, Mark woke up to the sound of his phone buzzing. His mother's name appeared on the screen. He sighed before answering, already dreading the conversation. "Mark, honey, I don't know what to do. The bills keep piling up, and your father's debt is still hanging over our heads." "I'm so sorry, I know, Mom," Mark interrupted, rubbing his eyes. "I'm trying, but things are just complicated." He paused for a moment, his gaze shifting toward the rain pouring outside the window. A heavy weight sat on his chest. The previous night's conversation with Eleanor kept replaying in his mind. Her affair so simple, yet so unimaginable. A marriage for the sake of business, an arrangement that could solve everything. It almost felt like a dream, one he couldn't quite believe. He stared out the window, the rain blurring his thoughts. But his mother's voice broke through again, bringing him back to reality. "Honey, we need to figure something out soon. I'm not sure how much longer we can hang on." Mark's heart tightened. He knew his mother was right. He didn't have much time. And then, Eleanor's words echoed in his head once again. "I need a husband." After a long moment of silence, Mark finally spoke. "I'll take care of it, Mom. I'll find a way." With that, he hung up the phone, his decision made. He knew what he had to do. Eleanor's offer was a lifeline, a solution to everything. But could he go through with it? Could he marry a woman he didn't even know, just to fix his life? The thought gnawed at him, but there was no turning back now. Later that afternoon, Mark arrived at Brooks' Bistro, the same place where Eleanor had given him that unforgettable offer. The rain had let up, but the sky was still overcast. He walked inside, his footsteps echoing in the empty bistro. Eleanor was already seated at their usual corner table, her back straight, eyes fixed on a laptop in front of her. When she saw him approach, she looked up, a faint smile crossing her face. "Mr. Davis," she said, her voice cool and controlled as always. "I'm glad you decided to come. Please, sit." Mark sat down across from her, trying to keep his nerves in check. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but now that he was here, everything seemed more real. Eleanor wasn't just some rich woman making an offer. She was someone with power, someone who could change his life in an instant. And yet, here he was, considering accepting her terms. "I've thought about your offer," Mark began, his voice steady despite the storm of thoughts racing through his mind. "And I'm willing to do it." Eleanor's eyes locked onto his, her expression unreadable. For a brief moment, Mark wondered if he had made a mistake. But then she nodded, as if she had been expecting this answer. "Good," she replied, her tone never changing. "I'll have my lawyer draw up the papers. Everything will be formal, of course. You'll be required to attend a few events with me, pose for photos, and maintain the image of a married couple. But, as I said before, there will be no romantic attachment. This is purely a business arrangement." Mark nodded, the reality of what he was about to do sinking in. "I understand," he said quietly. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her gaze softening just a fraction. "I know this may seem strange," she said, her voice almost sympathetic. "But I believe it's the best option for both of us." Mark didn't know what to say to that. He wasn't sure if he was making the right choice, but he also knew he didn't have many options left. As the conversation continued, the terms of their agreement became clearer. The paperwork, the events, the press appearances, everything was meticulously planned. It all felt so cold, so calculated. And yet, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that Eleanor had something more in mind. We'll begin tomorrow, Eleanor said, snapping Mark out of his thoughts. I'll have everything set up. She stood up, signaling that their meeting was over. Mark stood as well, his mind racing. As he walked out of the bistro, the weight of his decision pressed heavily on his shoulders. He had agreed to marry a woman he barely knew, in a contract that offered no promises of love or affection. But as he stepped into the cool evening air, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. What would happen when their fake marriage started to feel too real? Only time would tell. The next few days passed in a blur for Mark. He found himself swept up in the whirlwind of meetings, contracts, and strange events that were now his life. He had agreed to Eleanor's offer, a decision that both terrified and relieved him. The formalities of the marriage were all set, and now, all that was left was to go through with it. It wasn't until the evening before their first public appearance together that Mark started to feel the weight of the situation. He stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the collar of his suit. The sharp creases of the tuxedo, the polished shoes, it all felt so surreal. He had never dressed like this before. He wasn't used to the luxury Eleanor embodied. He wasn't used to being in this world at all. His phone buzzed, breaking his concentration. It was a text from Eleanor. Remember, tomorrow is the charity gala. You'll be attending with me as my husband. Stay close, look the part, and everything will be fine. Mark stared at the message, his stomach tightening. Look the part. That was the crux of this whole arrangement, wasn't it? He wasn't really her husband. He was just someone posing for the cameras, a placeholder for her image. Yet, he had to admit, there was something about Eleanor's calm demeanor that gave him a strange sense of reassurance. The following evening, Mark stood by Eleanor's side in the grand ballroom of the charity gala. The room was filled with wealthy businesspeople, celebrities, and socialites, all dressed to impress, laughing and chatting under the sparkling chandeliers. Mark felt out of place, as though he had wandered into a world that didn't belong to him. Eleanor, however, moved through the crowd with ease, her every step calculated, her poise commanding attention. Mark, stay close, Eleanor said softly as they moved through the room. Remember, we're a team tonight. Smile, don't look so stiff. You're doing fine. He nodded, his hands clammy in his pockets as they made their way to the stage. Eleanor was introduced as the evening's guest of honor, and Mark followed her, trying to seem as natural as possible. The spotlight hit them both as they stepped onto the stage, and Mark felt the eyes of the entire room on him. He wasn't sure if he was nervous about the people watching or the fact that this was all a lie that was now becoming harder and harder to tell. After the speeches and charity presentations, Eleanor led Mark to a quieter part of the ballroom, away from the crowd. She looked at him, her face softening slightly for the first time. You did well tonight, she said, her voice low. You kept up. It's important for us to maintain this image. Mark could tell there was more she wasn't saying, but he didn't press. He simply nodded. I don't belong here, Mark admitted after a moment, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to act in these circles. This whole thing feels wrong. Eleanor studied him for a moment, then smiled faintly. No one belongs here at first, she said, her tone surprisingly warm. But that's why we have to play the part. You don't have to love it, Mark. You just have to survive it. And maybe, eventually, it won't feel so fake. Mark wanted to believe her, but something in his chest told him that this whole arrangement was bound to unravel sooner or later. He had been living his life day by day, trying to get by, but now, he was playing a role. He wasn't just pretending to be her husband, he was pretending to be someone else entirely. As the night went on, Eleanor introduced Mark to several influential people, each handshake and conversation more formal than the last. Mark played his part, smiling when necessary, nodding in agreement. But underneath it all, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing himself in the process. When the evening finally came to an end, Eleanor and Mark made their way back to her private car. The drive back to her mansion was silent, both of them deep in thought. Mark couldn't help but feel a sense of disconnection, as if he were floating through life, caught between two worlds. As the car pulled up to the mansion, Eleanor spoke again. "This is just the beginning, Mark," she said softly, her gaze distant. "But we'll get through it. I promise." Mark stared out the window, the mansion looming in front of him. Was this the life he had agreed to? A life of appearances, of pretending? He didn't know what was real anymore. And as he stepped out of the car and into the cold night air, he couldn't shake the nagging thought that, somewhere along the way, he might have lost himself. What would happen when the walls between them finally came down? Only time would tell. The days following the gala felt like a strange dream to Mark. He had gone from being a struggling law student with mountains of debt to playing the part of a wealthy man's fake husband in the blink of an eye. The reality of it all was beginning to settle in, but the more time he spent with Eleanor, the more complicated things became. Mark's thoughts were always a jumbled mess. He was still unsure of where he fit into Eleanor's world. He spent his days in meetings, attending events, and going through the motions, but he never felt like he belonged. Eleanor was a woman of power, and he was just the man in the background, playing a role. It wasn't just the public appearances that wore on him. It was the quiet moments, when it was just the two of them. In the silence of her mansion, after the glitz and glamour of the charity events had faded, he started to notice small things, ways Eleanor would glance at him when she thought he wasn't looking, or the subtle gestures that spoke louder than words. One night, as they sat in the living room after a particularly exhausting event, Eleanor spoke up, her voice unusually soft. "I've been thinking," she said, looking down at her hands, her fingers fiddling with the edge of her wine glass, "about why I made this arrangement with you. I could have married anyone, but I chose you." Mark turned his attention to her, his curiosity piqued. He had never really asked why she had chosen him. He assumed it was because he was in a vulnerable position, someone who needed the money and would agree to her terms. But hearing her say that made him wonder if there was more to it. "Why me?" he asked quietly. Eleanor hesitated for a moment, her gaze flickering up to meet his. "I guess I needed someone who didn't want anything from me. You're not here for my money or my status. You don't need anything, and that makes you different from the people I usually deal with." Mark didn't know how to respond to that. He had never thought of himself as different. He had always been the guy who was trying to make ends meet, trying to get by, always worried about what he didn't have. But Eleanor's words stuck with him. He didn't need anything from her, and that made him valuable to her in a way he hadn't considered before. For the first time in weeks, Mark felt a flicker of something other than doubt. Could it be possible that Eleanor wasn't just using him? That maybe, just maybe, she had chosen him for reasons beyond the arrangement? As if sensing his thoughts, Eleanor continued. "I know this is a lot to take in. But sometimes, it's easier to live a life where you don't have to worry about appearances or obligations. To live a life where you're not expected to feel something you don't. You've given me that, Mark. And in return, I'm giving you everything you need." Mark looked at her, unsure of what to make of it all. Was she speaking the truth? Was this more than just a business deal for her? It was hard to say. The boundaries between what was real and what was fake had begun to blur. The next day, Mark found himself standing in front of Eleanor's office, the door slightly ajar. He had come to drop off some documents for her, but as he stood there, he heard her voice. It wasn't loud, but it was enough for him to pause. "I don't know why I let this happen," Eleanor was saying to someone on the phone. "I thought I could keep things under control, but now it feels like I'm losing control." Mark's heart skipped a beat. Was she talking about him? Was she regretting the arrangement? He wanted to push the door open, to confront her about what he had just heard. But something held him back. He didn't know what was real anymore. He didn't know what Eleanor really thought or felt. Before he could decide what to do, the door opened, and Eleanor stood there, her face unreadable. When she saw him, her expression softened. "I didn't hear you come in," she said, her voice calm. "Is everything okay?" Mark hesitated for a moment, then forced a smile. "Yeah, Everything's fine, he said, though his mind was racing. He wasn't sure if he could trust her words anymore. He wasn't sure if he could trust anything about this arrangement. As he handed her the documents, their fingers brushed briefly. A strange warmth spread through him, and for a moment, it felt like the walls between them were starting to crumble. But just as quickly as the moment came, it was gone. "Thank you," Eleanor said, her tone businesslike again as she took the papers. "We'll talk more about this later." Mark nodded and turned to leave, but as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing. Something inside him was starting to shift. What was this feeling? And what would happen when it finally came to the surface? The following week, things between Mark and Eleanor started to feel different. The lines between their contract and their growing connection blurred further, and Mark found himself constantly questioning what was real and what was part of the arrangement. Eleanor's words from their last conversation lingered in his mind, making him wonder if she truly didn't need anything from him. It was a strange thought, especially after everything they had agreed upon. But in the quiet moments, when they were alone, Mark couldn't ignore the way Eleanor looked at him, as though there was something more, something unsaid. One afternoon, as they sat together in her office, discussing an upcoming charity event they were supposed to attend, Mark couldn't help but notice how tired Eleanor seemed. She had always been so composed, so in control, but today there was something different in her eyes. It wasn't the usual coldness or distant professionalism. There was something vulnerable in her gaze, something that made Mark wonder if perhaps she, too, was beginning to feel the weight of their arrangement. Eleanor didn't speak for a few moments, and Mark, sensing that she was lost in thought, decided to break the silence. "Eleanor," he began carefully, "are you all right?" Her eyes flickered up to meet his, a flash of surprise crossing her face. She quickly regained her composure, though. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice a little too steady. "Just tired. Lots on my plate, you know." Mark nodded, but he could see through her mask. He could always tell when she was pretending. The way her shoulders were slightly slumped, the way her hand trembled as she reached for her glass of water, everything about her seemed a little off. She wasn't fine, and Mark wasn't sure how to approach it. "You don't have to do everything on your own, you know," he said, his voice softer now. "I'm here, if you need someone to talk to." For a brief moment, Eleanor's eyes softened. She opened her mouth as if she was going to say something, but then she closed it again, shaking her head. "It's complicated, Mark," she said quietly, almost to herself. "This isn't just about us anymore. It's about everything I've worked for, everything I've built." Mark leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" Eleanor hesitated, her gaze drifting to the window. For the first time, she seemed uncertain, almost fragile. "I've spent my whole life building this empire, Mark," she said slowly, her voice tinged with regret. "And now I'm at a point where I don't even know if it was worth it. I've been so focused on my career, on maintaining control over everything, that I forgot what it means to have someone real to rely on." The words hit Mark harder than he expected. He had always seen Eleanor as someone untouchable, someone who had it all together, someone who didn't need anyone. But now, in this moment, he saw a side of her he had never imagined. It was a side that wasn't just about power and control, but about vulnerability and fear. "You don't have to do it all by yourself," Mark repeated, his voice sincere. "You're not alone." There was a long pause, and Mark could see Eleanor's walls slowly starting to come down. She finally looked at him again, her eyes searching his as if she was trying to decide whether or not she could trust him with her feelings. "I don't know what's happening between us," she said softly. "This arrangement, it was supposed to be simple. But it's not. Not anymore." Mark's heart raced. He knew this moment was important, but he wasn't sure how to respond. Part of him wanted to tell her that he felt the same way, that he was starting to care for her in ways he hadn't expected. But another part of him was afraid. Afraid that if he admitted it, things would change, and he would lose everything he had been pretending to have. But then, as if sensing his hesitation, Eleanor reached out, her hand brushing his gently. The touch was unexpected, but it was enough to send a rush of warmth through him. Mark didn't know what was happening between them, but in that moment, he felt like they were no longer pretending. They weren't just playing roles anymore. "I don't know what this is, but I think we both need to figure it out," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark nodded, his heart pounding. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he wasn't just a pawn in someone else's game. For the first time, he felt like he mattered, like he had something real to hold on to. And despite the uncertainty, despite the confusion, he knew one thing for sure: things were about to change. What would happen next? Would their arrangement evolve into something more, or would they both realize that the walls between them had become too thick to break down? Only time would tell. The days that followed were filled with a strange tension between Mark and Eleanor. Despite the growing connection they were both beginning to feel, neither of them knew how to navigate this new territory. The line between what was real and what was fake had become increasingly blurry, and every interaction seemed to carry more weight than before. Mark had always kept a distance from people. His past had taught him to rely only on himself. But Eleanor was different. She was the first person to make him question everything, even the walls he had spent years building around his heart. One evening, after another long day of charity events and public appearances, Eleanor invited Mark to join her for a private dinner at her mansion. It wasn't anything extravagant, just the two of them, a quiet meal away from the cameras and the crowds. But for some reason, this evening felt different. As they sat down at the dining table, the silence between them was almost comfortable. They had spent so much time pretending, but tonight, there was no pretense. The walls were lower, the air between them warmer. "You've been distant lately," Eleanor said softly, breaking the silence. "Is everything all right, Mark?" Mark paused, looking down at his plate for a moment before meeting her gaze. He hadn't expected her to notice. The truth was, he had been pulling away. The weight of everything, the contract, the act of being her husband, the uncertainty of what was happening between them had been suffocating him. But when he looked at Eleanor now, there was something different in her eyes. A softness, a vulnerability that made him want to open up. He wasn't sure if he was ready to face it, but he couldn't ignore it anymore. "I don't know what's happening between us," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "This arrangement, it's not what I thought it would be. I thought I could just keep my distance, pretend like it didn't matter. But it does. It matters." Eleanor didn't speak right away. She simply watched him, her gaze unwavering. Mark could feel the weight of her scrutiny, but it wasn't judgment. It was understanding, as if she too was struggling with the same questions. Finally, she spoke. "I know," she said quietly. "I've been feeling it too. I never expected things to get this complicated. I thought this was just going to be a business arrangement, something we both would get through. But now, I don't know." Mark's heart raced as he heard the words he had been afraid to say himself. Eleanor was acknowledging what they had both been trying to avoid. They were no longer just playing a part, they were both feeling something real. "What are we supposed to do now?" Mark asked, his voice strained with uncertainty. Eleanor stood up slowly, walking to the window and looking out at the night sky. "I don't know," she said softly. "But I can't pretend anymore. I've spent my whole life pretending I didn't need anyone, pretending that power and control were enough. But now, with you, I don't know how to pretend anymore." Mark stood up too, walking over to her. There was something in the way she spoke, something raw in her voice that made him take a step closer, despite all the fear and confusion swirling inside him. "Eleanor," he said, his voice gentle. "You don't have to do this alone. You don't have to pretend with me." She turned to face him then, and for the first time, there was no mask. No walls between them. Just two people, raw and vulnerable, standing in the quiet of the night. "I'm scared, Mark," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm scared that if I let go, if I let myself care, I'll lose everything." I've worked so hard to build this life, and now, it feels like it could all come crashing down. Mark took her hand gently, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. You won't lose everything, he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. Not if you trust me. I'm here, Eleanor. I don't care about the money, or the power, or the image. I care about you. Just you. Her eyes searched his, as if looking for reassurance, or maybe a sign that he meant it. And when she found it, when she saw the sincerity in his eyes, she finally let go. The tension that had been building between them for so long began to dissolve. I don't know what's going to happen between us, she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. But I want to find out. I want to see where this goes. Mark nodded, a sense of relief flooding through him. For the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't pretending. He wasn't playing a part, he was just being himself, vulnerable, scared, but real. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't alone. As Eleanor leaned in, her lips brushing against his, Mark knew that their journey was just beginning. There would be challenges ahead, questions they still didn't have answers to. But for the first time, he felt ready to face them, side by side with her. What would happen next? Would they be able to break free from the past and build something real? Only time would tell. The following days were a whirlwind of emotions and decisions for Mark and Eleanor. The night they shared their vulnerability had been a turning point, and while things between them had shifted, both of them still struggled to define what this new chapter meant. The lines between their contract and the growing feelings between them blurred even further, and Mark felt an unfamiliar sense of hope mixed with uncertainty. Eleanor had been honest about her fears, and in turn, he had begun to open up about his own. But despite their connection, the realities of their situation still loomed over them. It was a week later when everything started to change. Eleanor had called him to her office, the same place where they had signed their agreement months ago. This time, the atmosphere was different. The usual professional distance between them was gone. There was a heaviness in the air as Mark stepped into the room. Eleanor was seated at her desk, papers spread out before her, but her focus was nowhere near the documents. Her eyes were distant, as though she had something important to say. Mark, she began, her voice steady but softer than usual. I've been thinking a lot about where we're headed. This contract, it was supposed to be simple. But it's not. And I don't want to keep pretending anymore. Mark felt his heart race as he stepped closer to her desk, waiting for her to continue. He didn't know what she meant, but the way she was speaking made him feel like everything they had built together was about to crumble. What are you saying, Eleanor? Mark asked, his voice slow and uncertain. Are you backing out? She shook her head slowly, her expression thoughtful, almost conflicted. No, she replied quietly. I'm not backing out. But I can't keep doing this if it's just a contract anymore. I've started to care about you, Mark, and I need you to know that. I'm not going to pretend it's just business when it's not. I've been afraid to admit it, afraid of what it could mean. But I can't ignore it anymore. Mark's breath caught in his throat. Eleanor, the woman who had been so controlled and distant, was finally admitting what he had been feeling for weeks. A rush of emotions surged through him. He had known something was changing between them, but hearing her say it out loud made it real. The walls he had spent so long building up were starting to crumble, and he had no idea how to navigate this new path. He took a deep breath, his mind racing. He had spent so much of his life protecting himself from getting hurt. But now, with Eleanor, everything felt different. He could feel his own walls starting to fall. Eleanor, he said softly, stepping closer to her. I've been feeling the same way. This arrangement was supposed to be simple, but it hasn't been. I care about you. More than I ever expected. Eleanor looked up at him, her eyes filled with something Mark couldn't quite define. There was hope there, but also fear. She reached out, her hand brushing against his. I don't want to keep pretending, Mark, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I don't want to lose you. Mark's heart skipped a beat as he gently took her hand in his. The weight of her words settled over him, but instead of feeling afraid, he felt a sense of calm. This was real. This wasn't just a contract anymore. This was something more. You won't lose me, he promised, his voice filled with certainty. I'm not going anywhere. For the first time, they both realized that their connection had grown beyond the walls they had built around themselves. It wasn't just about an arrangement anymore. It was about them, about what they were willing to risk for each other. And in that moment, Mark knew that no matter what happened next, they had both taken a step toward something real. Something that was worth fighting for. But the question remained, what would the future hold for them? Could they really move past their pasts and embrace the love they had found? Only time would tell. The following days felt like a dream to Mark. Everything had changed. The walls he had built around his heart, the walls he thought would protect him, had started to crumble, and with every passing moment, he found himself drawn deeper into Eleanor's world. Their relationship, once defined by a cold, businesslike arrangement, was now evolving into something far more complicated, something more real. But despite the emotional shift between them, there was still the question hanging over them: could they truly make it work? Could they both break free from their pasts and build something together, something beyond the charade they had started? Eleanor's confession, her admission that she had started to care, had opened a door between them. But neither of them knew what lay on the other side. One evening, after a long day of meetings and media appearances, Eleanor invited Mark to join her for a quiet dinner at her mansion. This wasn't a public event or a charity gala, it was just the two of them. And for the first time in a while, it felt like they could just be themselves. As they sat down at the dinner table, the usual tension between them was gone. The silence, instead of being awkward, felt comfortable. Eleanor reached for her glass of wine and took a slow sip, her eyes meeting Mark's. You know, Eleanor began softly, her voice almost contemplative, I've spent so many years trying to control everything around me. My work, my image, my life. But I never thought I'd find myself in a position like this. Mark looked at her, his heart racing. There was something in her eyes, a mix of fear and longing that made him feel both connected to her and afraid of what that connection could mean. What do you mean? He asked quietly, leaning forward slightly, his curiosity piqued. I mean, Eleanor continued, her voice softer now, I never thought I would need anyone. I thought I could control everything. But then, you came into my life. And I started to see that maybe, just maybe, there's more to life than power and control. Mark's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected her to say something like that. Eleanor, the powerful CEO, the woman who had everything, was admitting something he had never heard her say before: vulnerability. And in that moment, Mark realized that maybe, just maybe, they could build something together. Eleanor, Mark said, his voice steady but filled with emotion, I never thought I'd find someone who would make me feel the way you do. I've been afraid of letting myself care, but with you, it's different. I want to see where this goes. I want to make it work. Her eyes softened as she reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. The warmth of her touch sent a shiver down his spine. For the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't pretending. He wasn't hiding behind a mask. He was being real. I want that too, Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible. But we have to be honest with each other. We have to face the truth. This isn't just about a contract anymore. It's about us. And I'm not sure what that means yet, but I'm willing to find out. Mark nodded, his chest tightening. It wasn't going to be easy. There would be challenges ahead. There would be questions they didn't have answers to. But in this moment, sitting across from Eleanor, he knew one thing for sure: they were both ready to take the next step, to build something real. As they sat there, hands intertwined, the world outside seemed to fade away. It was just the two of them, two people who had been afraid to let go, but who had found something unexpected in each other. Something they couldn't deny. Whatever happens, Mark said softly, we'll figure it out. Together. Eleanor smiled, a small but genuine smile, as she squeezed his hand. Together, she agreed. And for the first time, Mark believed it. They didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in their lives, they were willing to face it head-on together. Weeks passed, and the bond between Mark and Eleanor continued to grow stronger. They had crossed the line from a business arrangement to something real, something deep. The contract that had once defined their relationship now felt like a distant memory. They had begun to navigate the world together, not as a CEO and her hired husband, but as two people who had chosen to trust each other, to take a chance on something more. But even as they settled into this new chapter, challenges still loomed. The outside world didn't know about their evolving relationship, and Eleanor's empire, her carefully crafted world, wasn't ready to accept any disruptions. There were still whispers, rumors, and expectations. Eleanor's position was precarious. Her legacy, her reputation, was built on control and precision. And now, with Mark by her side, things had become unpredictable. One evening, after another public charity event, Eleanor and Mark sat together on the terrace of her mansion. The city lights twinkled in the distance, but the quiet between them spoke volumes. Mark could sense that Eleanor was still wrestling with the complexities of their situation. She had always prided herself on maintaining control, and now, for the first time, she was letting go. "I've been thinking," Eleanor began, her voice soft and distant, as if she were talking to herself. "About everything about us. This whole journey we've been on. It's not what I expected. I thought I had everything figured out, but now, I'm not so sure." Mark sat beside her, his heart heavy with understanding. He knew the pressures she faced, the weight of the world on her shoulders. She had always been the one in charge, the one with the answers. And now, she was admitting that she didn't have it all figured out. "You don't have to have all the answers, Eleanor," Mark said gently, reaching for her hand. "I'm here. We're here together. That's enough." She turned to face him, her eyes searching his as if looking for reassurance. And in that moment, Mark realized that they had both changed. The walls between them, those walls they had so carefully built, had been torn down. They were no longer just two people pretending. They were real. They were in this together. "I've been so afraid," Eleanor admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "Afraid to lose everything I've worked for. Afraid that if I let go, I'll fall. But with you I feel like I have something worth fighting for. I'm not afraid anymore." Mark smiled, his heart swelling with love and admiration. Eleanor, the powerful, self-made woman he had once seen as untouchable, was now admitting that she was human. And that realization made him love her even more. "You don't have to do it alone," Mark said softly, his voice filled with certainty. "We're a team now. You don't have to carry the weight of everything on your shoulders. I'm here. I'll always be here." The quiet that followed was different this time. It wasn't filled with uncertainty or fear. It was filled with understanding, with the unspoken promise that they had each other's backs. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, Mark didn't feel afraid. They didn't have all the answers, but they had each other. As the night wore on, Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder, and for a moment, everything felt right. The chaos of the world outside seemed to fade away, leaving just the two of them, two people who had found something real amidst the uncertainty. And as Mark looked down at Eleanor, a sense of peace washed over him. No matter what the future held, he knew one thing for sure: they were stronger together. They had both taken a leap of faith, and now, they had a chance at something beautiful, something worth fighting for. "Together," he whispered, as the night sky stretched above them, full of endless possibilities. And in that moment, Mark knew that no matter what came next, they would face it side by side.